Welcome to the hybrid John Jay Homestead and to our temporary venue. I'm Melissa Vail, trustee of the Friends and chair of the Speakers Committee, and we're excited to have so many of you here in person and many more of you remotely, even some from zooming in on your school vacations. We can't see your backgrounds though. So welcome especially to the teachers and students in both parts of our audience, and everyone please turn off your phones. First, some webinar logistics for our remote attendees. You're all muted and video of you is turned off. If you have technical problems, please use the chat function for messages to your host. We already have some questions for our speaker, but we always want more good ones. Please use the Q&A feature to send us a question. And in-person audience, we have note cards and pencils for you if you want to submit a question. So let us know if you want one. Thank yous to the Bedford Playhouse for taking us in during the closure of Bedford House. Special thanks to our Speakers Committee for their indispensable support of these talks, and to our outstanding public partner, the New York Office of Parks, Recreation, and Historic Preservation, for everything. And as always, and most important, our members, who are our inspiration and our reason for being. Now, quick show of hands, how many of you are already members? Good. And thanks to you, and thank you in advance to everyone who's going to join really soon. Please take a look at our website for the rest of our season. On April 9th, we have Brenda Wineapple with her book about the Scopes trial, which was the first culture war in this country. On May 6th, we have Richard Brookhiser about John Trumbull, who thought of himself as a historian, even though his contemporaries thought of him as a painter. As you see, there are all ways of telling stories in media, in trials, in paintings, and tonight in obscure archives. Now here's a Zoom feature we're keeping, the survey. I'm going to ask you a question and we want a quick answer by show of hands, and on Zoom too. Many of us here are probably downstate New York City chauvinists. But during this period, New York City was the nearest thing to a slave power in the North, and this book takes place all over New York State, with some of the real action, the most exciting stories, and most important political reform advances coming from what I learned is called the burned over district in the central and western parts of the state. Now here's the survey question. How many people here have lived in any of those counties, including Chautauqua, Seneca, Cortland, Monroe, Oneida, Erie, Cayuga, Elmira, Niagara, or others? Anyone here? Okay, so that's like 6 people. Emily, how's our...
On Zoom, we have about 25% have lived in those counties.
Really? Huh. Very different. Sometimes our Zoom audience comes in differently from our in-person. Now, the last part from me before you get to hear our speaker. Those of you who've come to our talks before know that we look for a J connection to the topic of the evening. Tonight's story has to do with what we know and don't know about the J servants and slaves, and also about the site's upcoming restoration and reinterpretation. It comes from an unpublished essay written in 2000 by Jan Horton, a previous site manager, entitled Listening for Clorinda. You've seen that, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Clorinda was owned at different times by different branches of the Jays. She was the mother of Zilpa, who was born in 1791, also owned at different times by different members of the Jays. And then, this is Zilpa, at various times sold outside the family, possibly because she had a child, then rented back, working for the Jays, but her wages being paid to her owner $3 a month, then bought back, then manumitted, and then living out her life as a paid servant in Bedford and buried in William Jay's family plot at St. Matthew's just down the road. In 1837, Clorinda, the mother, died in Bedford. And here is how William Jay, the son of John Jay, the founder, described Zilpa's suffering in one of the site's very few descriptions of the interior life of any of the servants. Quote, "Her situation is truly to be pitied. She has no relation and scarcely an associate. She positively refused to sleep any longer in the white room in which her mother died. Whether this arose from a feeling of superstition or merely from painful association, I do not know. The result has been that she has a bed in the same chamber with the white maid and takes her place in the kitchen with the other servants." That's the end of the quote. One of the important elements of the restoration and reinterpretation of the homestead is giving a much fuller telling of the stories of the servants and slaves, and we expect that we will continue to learn more about them. We aren't sure which was the white room, probably on the 3rd floor, but we will finally have a proper kitchen, a cook's room, a man's room, and other spaces illustrating those important stories, and we'll tell you when you can come and see them. Now, finally, our speaker. Sarah Gronningsater is Assistant Professor of History at the University of Pennsylvania, where she is particularly interested in how ordinary citizens petitioned for rights and resources in the 19th century and transformed democratic practices in their everyday lives, and thereby in the country. She's won multiple prizes, fellowships, and dissertation awards, and at Penn, 3 awards for distinguished teaching. She also offers a course I just learned on the history of American baseball. So, good evening, Sarah, and welcome. You start off.
All right, thank you. Thank you for that lovely introduction. Thank you for inviting me here. It is such a pleasure to be with you all this evening. I have been working on this book for over 12 years, 13 years, and I have some slides I want to show you, and some of them will actually be from a visit I did at the John Jay Homestead to look at some of the archival material there, I think back in 2012. So it is so nice to be able to share this long labor of love with you. I'm going to just spend about 10 or 15 minutes telling you first what this book is about, and then I think we'll have a conversation about it. Okay, so what is this book about? The main characters are a generation of black children born between the 1790s and 1830s in New York. So this is a story about the end of slavery in New York State and the end of slavery in the entire United States, and how this particular generation is a key part of that story. They shaped how emancipation happened in the state of New York, and I'll explain to you what that process actually looked like. They changed the laws of citizenship and equality in New York State. And then they took what they learned as children and as teenagers and young adults, and they tried to expand anti-slavery laws and politics in the nation at large. So the book actually ends with sort of the more familiar story. It ends with Abraham Lincoln and Frederick Douglass and the Gettysburg Address and the Emancipation Proclamation and the Reconstruction Amendments. And part of what I want to try to convince you tonight is that this generation is actually a really important part of that story. Now, I'm speaking to, I hope, a friendly audience here. Sometimes when I speak to non-New Yorkers, I have to explain to them why anyone who cares about the story of emancipation in the United States should care about New York. And the reason actually is because of just how powerful New York and its politics was in the 19th century. A contemporary proverb was, as New York goes, so goes the Union. New York was a swing state. It provided a number of vice presidents and presidents. It created new political parties. You couldn't really do much nationally in the 19th century if you didn't have New Yorkers and their voters and their politicians on board. The other reason, other than just its political might, which also went along with economic and financial might in New York, was just the fact that New York was a place where slavery had also been particularly prominent. So to tell the story of the 19th century emancipation story in the United States, it needs New York as a political story and also as a state that had its own really complicated and thorny past with slavery itself. This is a map that I often show my students. I teach a number of history classes at the University of Pennsylvania. We always spend some time on this map. I ask my students to tell me what they see. One thing that eventually comes up is the point that New York, on the eve of the American Revolution, had almost 5,000 more enslaved people than Georgia, right? So my students who sort of think of like Georgia, it's the deep South, it's the Cotton South. If you actually look in the 18th century, slavery was completely embedded in New York's political economy. And you can see in the North, slavery is legal in all 13 states when the United States becomes an independent nation, but New York in particular had been particularly wedded to slavery. So what ends up happening in the 1770s as the American Revolution is getting underway is there's a push, right? The American Revolution cracks things open. It's a war. It's a moment of new political ideas. All of the 13 colonies write new independent state constitutions. And so people are asking questions about what are these states in this new nation going to be like? And there are a number of voices that speak out against slavery at this moment. The far left is the poet Phyllis Wheatley, who begins writing anti-slavery poetry that gets published in the 1770s. Some of her poems are actually published in New York papers at the time. There are black men who fight on both sides of the war. In the northern states, quite a lot of black men fight for revolutionary regiments and get freedom because of it. Just because I'm still in teacher mode, I'm teaching this semester, can anyone tell me who the people in the hats are? If you see up there? Can I get audience participation? They're Quakers. They're Quakers. Quakers are sort of particularly known for being in Pennsylvania, but Quakers are actually, there's tens of thousands of Quakers actually in New York State. And Quakers in New York are particularly important to the story of anti-slavery politics in this time period. And then we have on the far right someone who was good friends with John Jay. He's another founding father. It's Gouverneur Morris. And so Gouverneur Morris, when New York State is crafting its own 1777 state constitution, actually argues that there should be measures in the New York State Constitution against slavery that would slowly end slavery. He's defeated. Jay was actually part of crafting that same independent state constitution, but he'd gone away from the convention. His mother was ill. But he ends up writing to Morris, saying that he thought that the New York State Constitution was like a harvest cut before it was ripe. They had finished it too soon, and that he had wanted a clause against the continuation of domestic slavery. Now, Jay is indeed an important part of especially the beginning of my book. I don't want to sort of presume too much or too little of your own knowledge of sort of Jay's role. I realize I'm in a Jay-friendly room. But Jay, when he is running for governor of New York, his anti-slavery position actually becomes an important part of the elections. So people who are in favor of Jay, including people like Quakers, are sort of hoping he wins the governorship. And then people who are his enemies actually use his anti-slavery positions against him as a reason not to vote for him. There are absolutely constituencies across New York, even in the 1790s, who are adamantly against the idea of freeing slaves. And Jay actually narrowly loses an election in 1795, but he runs again in 1798, and he wins. The following year, New York State passes an act for the gradual abolition of slavery. And this is sort of the big legal moment that slowly begins to end slavery in New York State. And I just want to say a couple of things quickly about what this law looks like. So what this law says, this 1799 law that Jay supports, is that children born to enslaved mothers after July 4th of 1799 will be born free. So you're going to have a generation of children, and this is the generation who are in the title of the book. This generation of children are going to be born free. Their mothers will remain enslaved, their older siblings, their fathers, their grandparents. So it's this very staggered, slow process whereby this generation becomes free. They are immediately, however, made legal servants. So that's what I have highlighted here in green. A servant in this situation is a technical legal category, and there are indentured servants, there are pauper servants, there are apprentices. They immediately became servants and had to work until their 20s for their mother's masters. So you can see that this is why the act is literally called the Gradual Abolition of Slavery, how long it would take for generations to become fully free and to have free children themselves. So the interrelated arguments of this book are about this rising generation, these children, that the New York State and its people, particularly these children, are important to the history of emancipation in the United States, and not just famous people. What I'm really interested in this book are these thousands of children and their parents, these ordinary people who, as I hope I'll convince you, help sort of the more famous people and push the more famous people to make the end of slavery go faster in the state and in the country. And this generation is at the heart of this struggle. So in researching this book, what I did for a very long time, and this is why it took like 12 to 15 years, is I drove around to all of these different town clerks and county clerks across New York State, and I tried to find records about these children. The laws stated that when these children were born free, that they were supposed to have essentially birth certificates, which were lodged with local town clerks, which recorded the fact that they were free. You can imagine if you were sort of a sneaky owner or a sneaky master, you'd want to sort of hide these children so you could keep them as slaves for life. So having it down on paper that they were free could be meaningful, especially if you had sort of local abolitionists or officials or parents who would make sure that that freedom got protected. I looked at a lot of legal archives to try to find the voices of these children and these parents. Sometimes these children ended up in front of district attorneys because someone was trying to protect their freedom, protect them from being kidnapped. Sometimes they were being dragged into court because they were accused of crimes. But these are some of the sources that I used to try to get at the experiences of these children. I looked a lot at schools. So John Jay was a member of a group called the New York Manumission Society. So was Alexander Hamilton, James Duane, a lot of his sort of elite political friends, a lot of Quakers. Thousands of black children were educated in these schools. There were 6 schools in New York City by the 1820s, and so I tracked a lot of these children through these records. One thing I particularly like about this picture, and to stress to you, is these schools were co-ed from the beginning. So there's young black girls and young women who are also being educated in these schools. The girl from the second from the bottom, Matilda Williams, who wins a prize for public speaking, is the daughter of the first black Anglican priest in New York named Peter Williams. So that's his daughter, Matilda. I also tracked in my research, the voting documents of black men. So black men actually were able to vote in this time period. New York's 1777 Constitution had not said anything about race in terms of voting qualifications. So I found evidence from across the state of hundreds and hundreds of black men voting in their local areas. And I mentioned to you earlier that New York was a swing state. There were some state assembly elections that were decided by 1 or 2 votes. So even if you had 10 black men voting in a town, you might actually change the partisan preference of the entire state legislature. So these voters were really important, and these black men put anti-slavery lawmakers into the state legislature, and some of the laws that those state legislatures passed actually sped up this process of gradual abolition. So I'll tell you just briefly, only a few slides left. You've been very patient, but I hope this is good groundwork. I took the title, The Rising Generation, from black teachers and black ministers. So here's an example from Troy, a couple hours north of here on the Hudson River Valley. It's a city across from Albany. And this teacher, Elizabeth Wicks, is giving an address to the African Female Benevolent Society and talks about these children as the rising generation, right? This is an entire generation of children who are told by their parents, by ministers, by mentors that you are born into a different situation than we were, and we expect great things of you. So there's a political consciousness within the generation, and sort of the charge that they're given to do things when they're adults. And part of what they do as adults, they do a lot of things as adults, but they begin pushing their state legislature as free adults to pass stronger anti-slavery laws. And so I particularly like this. This is from the late 1830s. You can see there's a petition of fathers and mothers, of men and women of color in the city of New York. And they pass a bunch of laws in this time period in the late 1830s and 40s. And one of the laws that these black New Yorkers get passed says that no one, even if they're visiting from a southern state, are allowed to bring their slaves into the state of New York. New York is absolutely free soil. You cannot hold someone as a slave in the state of New York. And here's where I'm going to bring in the Jays again. In 1852, there's a family called the Lemons, a white family from Virginia, and they want to move to Texas. And the fastest way to actually get to Texas in this time period is to take a ship from Virginia to New York, and then to get on another ship going to New Orleans, and then go to Texas. So it's almost like catching like a sort of a, like a flight if you have to sort of catch a connection. So this white Virginian family arrives in New York City with 8 enslaved people. It's 2 young mothers, they're in their early 20s, and their children. So 6 young children, 2 young mothers. And a bunch of black abolitionists find out that these women and their children are on board. They get them into court, and the lawyer who represents them in court is John Jay's grandson. I think he's often called John Jay too by those who know him well. And what ends up happening is the judge frees the 8 people. The case gets appealed twice. Virginia goes bananas. It becomes a national scandal. The governor of Virginia funds the slave owners' appeals. They ask other southern states to support their right to bring slaves anywhere in the country. 3 times New York's courts say, we stand by this law. And again, it was a law passed in part because black New Yorkers had asked for it, that says that you cannot hold enslaved people in our state. And so they sort of stick it to the slave power. Now this case I actually think should be a lot more famous. Lincoln actually talks about it during his famous Senate campaign in 1858, his House Divided speech. He talks about the concern that the United States Supreme Court might say that New York can't do such a thing, right? This is the United States Supreme Court that has recently ruled in the Dred Scott case that black Americans can't be citizens of the United States. And so Lemon actually becomes a rallying cry. This case becomes a rallying cry. And when Lincoln is running for president in 1860, I think this is really interesting. The Lincoln-Douglas debates, his famous Senate speeches, get advertised here in the New York Tribune. So does the Dred Scott case, but so does the Lemon case. People at the time really thought about what New York courts and its anti-slavery citizens had done as they were thinking about whether or not they were going to elect a president who was anti-slavery. And the records at the Jay Homestead were so crucial to my research here. So this was back from 2012. I don't know if you can sort of see the screenshot there. That's a long time ago. I didn't have kids. I didn't have my job at Penn. I was like a little scrappy grad student trying to find some good stuff. And I found amazing stuff at the John Jay Homestead. Alan Weinrib was working there at the time, who helped me spend a couple of days going through the archives there. And so I'll just finish with 2 quick slides. I know you've had other guests here, David Gelman and Judge Rosenblatt, who might be watching tonight, who've also actually written about some of these same subjects. You get really good people here.
Yes, we do.
It's so exciting. Both David Gelman and Al Rosenblatt have been sort of mentors to me, and so there's sort of a collection of us who've been really interested in these questions. And here's my last slide. My final sort of argument in the book is by the time we get to the Civil War and Reconstruction, that we can actually better understand some of the most important steps forward that our nation has taken, abolishing slavery in the 13th Amendment, guaranteeing the right to vote regardless of color in the 15th Amendment, not gender, they got there later, 14th Amendment, equal treatment under the law, birthright citizenship. This stuff is relatively familiar to people, but what I argue in the book is that the politics, the ideas, some of the actual wording, the language that we see here actually comes from this much longer struggle by New Yorkers to think about what citizenship meant, what equality meant, what it meant to end slavery quickly as opposed to gradually, and that this bigger story that we're more familiar with really needs to start with the generation and the process that I described earlier in the book. So that's my opening spiel.
Well, my job is done. It's such an amazing book with so many specific thrilling stories, but also so many big themes. I'm going to just jump around from one to the other, but I'm going to start with a student question from Grant Klein, who is our most loyal student who shows up at these things and who is the co-founder of the American History Club at his high school. So we love Grant, and his question is, given the limited documentation of Black lives in early America, how did you navigate gaps in the historical record? And talk about the archives that you did find, and talk about whether there still are big category gaps out there.
That is an excellent question. Grant is the name of the student. Yep. Grant, thank you for that question.
Hello, Grant.
I want to show you So one of the archives that I did use where I could find things in ways that might not have, okay, here we go. So a lot of information about the interior lives of enslaved children. It's hard to research children in general, no matter who they are, but particularly enslaved children or children who are servants. Many of them could not read and write, leave their own records, and even though many children of this generation did go to school, it's actually a highly literate generation. Their parents couldn't, right? And so you have to, there's ways you have to sort of put the puzzle pieces together the best that you can. But I actually would say this to Grant and to anyone interested in this history. There is a lot out there. It's just harder to find. And so this example that I wanted to show you is this is from the District Attorney Indictment Papers. This is in the Municipal Archives of New York. I will say that it is now run quite well. When I started 12 or 15 years ago, it was like going to like the worst day of the DMV on the worst day, right? Like nothing's working, the lines, like no one's happy you're there, no one's interested in helping you. You know, I was, you know, this little grad student coming in being like, can I please like have some microfilm reels about, you know, like it was not fun. But I found some really interesting stuff if you're like persistent. And so this is an interrogation of a young girl. Her name is Charlotte. You can actually sort of see it in the middle of the screen. It has her mark. She's probably something like 12, 13-year-old girl. She's brought before the grand jury because she was accused of trying to burn her master's house down. It's pretty clear that her master was a vicious guy. I mean, one thing I just don't want to romanticize here is just how violent and lonely the situation that these children were in. She had said that she had been beaten, and so she wanted to burn down his house. What is interesting in this interrogation is the district attorney asks her a bunch of questions. And he asks her, are you free or are you a slave? And she says, I'm free. And he says, well, what do you mean by that? And she says, I was born free and I am to work a certain number of years only. She's basically describing that indentured servitude that I showed you when I showed you the 1799 law. And she says, and he says, how long do you have to serve? And she says, until I'm a big woman. And that always sort of breaks my heart a little bit, right? You can imagine that's how a girl would describe it, until I'm a big woman. She knows that, you know, she's going to be an adult woman at some point, she'll be free, but she has these years of service. But this was such a moment in the archives where I could prove that these children had a consciousness of their own status, right? She says to this group, I mean, it's all white men in that room, I'm free. And she knows that that is legally something that she is owed. Which suggests to us that even though she certainly wasn't going to school, she probably couldn't read and write, she says at one point in this series of questions that she doesn't live near her mother. Her mother's in the countryside, she's working in the city. Clearly someone had talked to her, right? It was whether it was her mother before she got sort of put to this other situation, whether it was other children who she met in alleyways when she was working in her master's kitchen. Someone had said to her something about like that she had certain, even if they were small, certain rights. The district attorney also actually asked her if she can read or write, and it's because at that point, by this time period, New York had actually passed a law mandating that children of this generation get schooling. They either had to go to public school or they had to be taught to read or write at home. And so even the fact that the district attorney is asking her, do you know how to read or write, is because a lot of these children were learning how to read and write. So this is a moment in the archives where we actually, if you sort of do you grind it out and you like, but again, this isn't digitized, it's not in a pretty card catalog, there's no nice librarian helping you. There's stuff left for like young historians to do. There's also so much we will just never know. And that is also something I actually try to be quite frank about in some of my footnotes and as I write, of the ways where I sometimes try to responsibly imagine what someone might have sort of, the choices that face them, why they might have done certain things, but I will never have their diary. I will never have the letter they wrote, and that is just when you study slavery and you study African American history in this time period, a reality.
So you sort of skipped over one part of the statute, which is the obligation on the part of the, what do we call them, masters or employers, whatever, the people that these children are bound out to, to teach these kids to read or write. And if they don't, then their period of servitude is shortened, right? So there are consequences to that. And the other thing that I thought was really interesting was the government structure that oversaw this whole system. This is a brand new system, and the analogy that they, or the structure that they drew from was the poor law. And so talk a little bit about whether these children were treated differently or the same as the children of paupers, and that the poor relief was the most expensive item in a city's budget. So this was not nothing. So how did that work?
Thank you so much for that question, because I could talk about poor law. Poor law is one of those things, when I introduce it to my undergraduates, they're like, that. I actually give them a syllabus, for the whole semester, and one day is just about poor law. And the students get to sign up for like the day they want to write reading reflections, and like very few people are excited about poor law. But if I've done my job by the end of the semester, they actually understand how deeply important poor law is to local governance in this time period. When the English settlers come over here, they take English poor law with them. In the Elizabethan era, there's all these sort of new statutes about sort of how do you regulate people where you live who are poor, who are orphaned, who are sick, widows, etc. So all of these towns across New York State already basically have this government official called the Overseers of the Poor. And one of the jobs of the Overseers of the Poor is, if there are poor children, white children, is to take those children and bind them out to local families as a way of making sure that they're sheltered and fed. Now, when poor white children are bound to service, this is again a hundreds-years-old tradition, they are bound to ages 18 if you're a girl, 21 if you're a boy. So you can see immediately in this law, in some ways, black children were treated as though they were bound to service by the Overseers of the Poor, but with much longer terms of service, right? So black children face much more time being unpaid forced laborers than a similar white children would be. And part of what you mentioned, the law that requires, so usually, traditionally, and a lot of this is also just common law, it's custom, is that children in these situations are supposed to be taught to read and write. And what was pretty clear from the beginning is that people were not teaching black children how to read and write. And so that's where I mentioned those black men voting, and people like Jay and his colleagues in the New York Manumission Society. They actually passed additional legislation that required that these children be taught to read and write just as similar white children would be. But that's a political fight that takes sort of pressure on the legislature to make those laws sort of somewhat more equal between white children and black children in similar situations.
Fascinating. The people. Who were some of the children who became famous activists from this generation? It's pretty much all the black leaders that we then come to know of. Did they all get educated at the African Free School or in Manumission Society schools? Just tell us what these children were like. You have great stories about James McCune Smith when he was 14. And anyway,
yes.
Tell us more about these people when they were kids.
So this African Free School, which is, it's founded in 1785 by Jay and a bunch of his colleagues. It's very small in the beginning, but like I said, by the 1820s, thousands of black children in New York City are going there. And the other thing that's happening simultaneously, and this is where I really, Melissa, you set me up so nicely about how this book is really interested in all of New York State, including the burnt over district. This is actually roughly the same moment where New York State is starting what we today would call its public school system. The New York State legislature is saying we want local areas to set up public schools, we'll help fund you, you're going to have local school boards, you need to also raise local taxes. And so part of what I was able to show in the book is there's actually black children across New York State who are going to school. It's not just the school in New York City, although the school in New York City is really important. But there are black children going to public schools across New York State. Sometimes in integrated schools in very rural areas, sometimes in segregated, there'd be separate schools. In this New York City school, the African Free School, a number of incredibly important black leaders go there. So you mentioned James McCune Smith, there's Henry Highland Garnett, Alexander Crummell, Ira Aldridge, the Reason brothers. Charles Reason becomes one of the first black professors in the United States. But James McCune Smith is a particular favorite of mine, so I'll just briefly tell you about him. He was born to an enslaved mother, so he's absolutely one of these children of this generation. He goes to the African Free School. It is very clear from the beginning the trustees and the teachers realize just how brilliant this kid is. When General Lafayette comes back to the United States on his grand tour after the American Revolution, he comes back to the US and sort of does, here's this hero of the American Revolution, the French ally comes back. He speaks to schools and churches across the country, and he speaks at the African Free School, and James McCune Smith, as a 14-year-old, is chosen to give the speech and to meet General Lafayette. Eventually, James McCune Smith becomes the first Black American to earn a medical degree. He is unable to attend medical school in the United States because no medical school will take him because he is Black. He goes to Glasgow in Scotland, earns his medical degree in Scotland, comes back to New York, and spends the rest of his career. He's an intellectual, he's a doctor, he's a pharmacist. He's the doctor at the Colored Orphan Asylum that famously gets burned to the ground during the Civil War draft riots in 1863. He is writing every important white politician in New York State with his anti-slavery views. He dies in 1865, so he lives to see most of what happens in the Civil War. But he is, and the last, sorry, I said it was last, I'll say one more quick thing just because it's so good. Frederick Douglass, probably the most famous Black male abolitionist of the 19th century, eventually settles in New York and Rochester. And I think one thing that I wish everyone Douglass sort of stands on his own as just sort of an iconic figure. But part of how Douglass becomes Douglass is because he meets all of these people. James McCune Smith writes this great letter where he's like, Frederick Douglass finally gets it, right? Because Douglass originally went to Massachusetts and was all into Massachusetts abolitionist politics, and they had a different way of doing things. And the New Yorkers had their own brand of anti-slavery politics, and James McCune Smith was so glad that sort of Douglass was now sort of thinking politically more like Black New Yorkers were. So that's, I think it's sort of in microcosm one of the arguments of the book, is like it starts here and it spreads out to some of these larger figures that we're already familiar with.
Louis Napoleon.
Yes.
Who was he? I mean, you didn't name him in the Lemon Case, but tell us, what do we know about him? He was not literate.
No. So Louis Napoleon is actually, in some ways, he's the same age as James McCune Smith. Mm-hmm. So he's, and I think that's why I sort of wanted to study many different people in this generation, because they had some common experiences, and there was also diversity within this generation's experience. Louis Napoleon is around the same age as James McCune Smith. He is also born to an enslaved mother. He doesn't, as far as we know, ever learn how to read or write. He begins to appear in the archival record in the early 1840s. He's a manual laborer. He's a whitewasher. So he like literally paints, houses and fences white for a living. But it's pretty clear that at some point in the 1840s, he becomes deeply involved in the Underground Railroad, and what I also sort of like to think of as the above-ground railroad. So this whole Lemon Case, it happened out in the open. It happened in courts. It was talked about in newspapers. It was public lawyers. Napoleon clearly just had a tremendous network of connections around people working on the docks, people working around the city. So he actually helped hundreds and hundreds of slaves escape on the Underground Railroad. So if you were kind of coming into New York and you had to run away from the Deep South trying to get free up in upstate New York or up in Canada, Louis Napoleon probably was the person helping you. And he ends up having these relationships with John Jay too, with Sidney Howard Gay, who ran the local anti-slavery office. And this was another place, going back to Grant's great question, is I was on this like maniacal hunt for a while to find every possible reference to Louis Napoleon. He's sort of an example of again, I always don't want to presume everyone knows who Harriet Tubman is, but most people know who Harriet Tubman is, this like great sort of goddess of the Underground Railroad. Her counterpart was Louis Napoleon, this New Yorker, who was doing very similar work here in New York. And so, we think about, I'll say one last thing on this thing. When South Carolina secedes from the Union, South Carolina is the first state to secede from the Union during the Civil War. They're sort of the most rabid of the fire eaters in South Carolina. There's a line when South Carolina says, here's why we're leaving the Union. They write a declaration of secession, it's kind of like a Declaration of Independence. They're like, here's why we're mad, here's why we're leaving. There's a line in South Carolina's Declaration of Secession that New York will not let slaves go in transit through their state. Their courts have denied that right. That's Louis Napoleon, right? Like, South Carolina is starting the Civil War because of Louis Napoleon and his partnership with John Jay too.
One of the things that happened toward the end of the Lemon Case is funds were raised to certainly support the enslaved, the Lemon slaves, and help them get to Canada, right? That's where
Correct.
They ended up. But funds were also raised to compensate the Lemons. And then the Lemons signed a release, and that's probably why why was the Lemon case never appealed to the Supreme Court? The Court of Appeals upheld New York's position 3 times, completely definitively. And I've heard 2 arguments. One was that they didn't want to take it to the Supreme Court because they were afraid of that court and Taney and Dred Scott, or 2, that the Lemons had actually waived their rights because of having signed that release. What do you think?
So I think a number of things were going on. One is I wrote a separate article that I published about this actually, because as I said, I got pretty obsessed with Louis Napoleon and I had too much about him and I wanted to get more stuff published. Napoleon and John Jay actually at one point petitioned the governor of New York not to back the case, right? So both New York and Virginia, the state governments of New York and Virginia funded these appeals because they both felt like they had to protect their own state rights. We often think of the South as sort of being the state's writers. In this time period, sometimes the North was. The North was like, we have these Southerners and they're trying to catch fugitive slaves and they're sending slave owners into our states. We have the right, our state right, to decide what happens on our soil. And the Republican governor of New York wanted to keep funding these appeals, and Napoleon and Jay petitioned him and said, stop. We actually don't want this going up the state appellate system, because if it reaches our highest court, it can then be appealed to the United States Supreme Court. We are terrified of the Taney Court, as you just suggested, and we're worried that we might get a ruling from this Dred Scott court that actually would permit American citizens to take their property anywhere in the country. That possibly Taney might say that a South Carolinian could take their slaves up to New York, because to deny him that right would be to deny his Fifth Amendment rights not to have property taken without due process. So that is one argument, and in some ways I'm a little bit hedging because I think it was all of these things. The other thing that you didn't mention, which I do think was part of it, was by 1860 there's a new governor of Virginia. And he's a little less of a rabid fire eater. And so one of the arguments, too, is that Virginia was also sort of, could see that like we were possibly heading to civil war, and Virginia sort of wanted to cool it a little bit. And then there was the argument also of like, because the slaves were now free and the Lemons had been essentially paid for them, that it was moot, that they had no standing because they actually hadn't, at this point, they'd been paid for the property that had been lost. So I realized I don't know that which one I think it is. I do think it probably, I think the governor of Virginia thing slowing down probably was a huge part of it too. Yeah.
We also have a story in New York that's a sort of early Rosa Parks story.
Yeah.
Talk about that.
Yes. So I don't even realize, unless if you know how well you just set me up here. Hold on, where's my, nope, this way. Sorry, I just want to show you that voting document that I had up earlier. Here it is. Okay. So Thomas Jennings, you can see, is the person who you can actually see he can write. So this is a black man. He's a small business owner. He's one of the first black men to actually get a patent from the United States government. He owns a dry cleaning business. He has 5 children, and he becomes, at this point, I think he's like in his early 20s and is already very politically involved. And what this document is he's helping other black men vote. New York passed legislation that said black men, only black men, had to take special documents to the polls in order to prove they were free in order to vote. It's essentially like a voting ID document. And this is Thomas Jennings helping other men get this document by attesting to the fact that they're free. Thomas Jennings, so you can imagine, I've already sort of explained what Thomas Jennings is like, what his children might be like. So he has 5 children. They all become quite successful. One of them is a daughter. She's a school teacher named Elizabeth Jennings. In the 1850s, Elizabeth Jennings is trying to get home from church, and she tries to get on one of New York City's streetcars. These are all private companies at the time. So if you sort of wanted to go across what is now Manhattan, you would get on a private streetcar company going down a certain avenue. And she gets on the streetcar. They will not allow her to ride because she's a black woman, and she ends up suing the streetcar company. And some of her lawyers and some of the people who back her case are sort of in John J. 2's circles. It's sort of eventually the men who end up creating the Union League during the Civil War. But she sues the streetcar company and she wins. And it's a long process, but slowly New York streetcars and public transportations get desegregated. And it's partly because of the daughter of Thomas Jennings, Elizabeth Jennings, who is in some ways the Rosa Parks of New York City. And I like that story too because it sort of tells you sort of the generational passing on of sort of politics and commitments that you see across families over the course of this long 19th century.
Let's think about the schools. You say, excuse me, that the African Free School from the beginning had a broader mission than educating individual children, that they wanted to be members of the Republic and become a town square. What does that mean, and how does that affect the children who go to the school and their families too, who are sending their children to this school and the other schools?
So the school from the beginning is very much in the public eye. And you can see here the children sort of, for example, learn how to do public speaking. So every couple of months, the school actually opens its doors and they advertise this in the local newspapers and actually sort of show, here's what we're doing in these schools. And in a nation where slavery is ubiquitous, there's certainly still slavery in New York City. These battles over what to do with slavery are being fought in Congress. They're being fought in various state legislatures. To have a black school with black children as sort of, it becomes sort of a public and political institution in a way that a similar school for white children wouldn't have that same sort of public meaning and import. When these children are in these exhibitions, they're often reading anti-slavery poetry, given anti-slavery speeches. Local city council members are invited, and then the newspapers, the sympathetic newspapers, sort of write things up afterwards and say, like, it is so safe to abolish slavery because look at sort of like what black citizens will have. They're educated, they're smart, they're focused. It's a quite honestly bourgeois sort of argument too. It's like, look, we're going to create sort of like good, well-behaved, well-read, literate citizens, and so to end slavery is going to do no harm to society, and in fact it will benefit society because we'll have these good people in our citizenry. And there are, by this point, by the 1790s, early 1800s, there's black teachers, there's black headmasters. Some of these black teachers and black headmasters open the school at night for adults who never learned how to read or write. Political meetings are held there. And so these schools, and this is true at the African Free School, but it's true across the state, especially in places where there are black schools, they are physical sort of brick and mortar places where black parents, black leaders, black ministers can meet and sort of think about what's locally important to them. And so the schools in that sense they're schools and all the reasons we think schools are important, but they also have sort of this broader institutional meaning that is significant to, I think, the politics of this generation.
But then there comes a time when the district schools are either required or decide to have integrated schools, and the dynamic of having the black parents and administration lose control over their schools, it's not unambiguous that it's only moving forward, right? I mean, how does that work?
That's absolutely right. So in the late 1830s, the New York Manumission Society ends up basically folding, and they had been running the schools. And they turn the schools over to the local public school board, the sort of larger New York City public school board. And it's not great for these schools. These had been, I mean, no schools are perfect, but they've been these 6 sort of flourishing schools run by black teachers for black students. And all of a sudden now they're sort of part of the larger city system. And what the city does is it's basically sort of lowers the rigor of the schools. And one of the sort of the prides of the African Free School had been the sense of like our curriculum is really strong. We sort of expect, equal intellectual outcomes as other similar white schools. And when these schools are folded into the New York City system, that changes. And so there's the black parents basically like start boycotting the schools and start sending their children to black private schools. And the city board gets sort of nervous about this, and why are all the black children leaving? And so there's actually a series of meetings. And one thing I think is interesting, it's apparently mostly black mothers who go to these meetings and sort of negotiate with these members of the school board. And they actually win some victories. There's new high schools are open, and there's a promise from the New York City School Board to, I think, something like, quote unquote, run these schools in the sort of the same terms that they're run for white children. And so that there's at least a promise of sort of the rigorous standards being upheld.
So we
but
have
it's
an
rocky.
early Brown versus Board of Education, too.
Yeah.
All these things happened.
Yes.
in New York.
Yeah.
Makes you proud to be a New Yorker,
Yeah.
gotta say. You also talk about a transition from soft political power to hard political power. It has to do with the expansion of the franchise and voting restrictions, and then all of the totally predictable levers of hard political power come into play, right?
Yeah.
Talk about how that worked.
So initially, as I've said, black men vote in actually quite high numbers. And partly because they vote in such high numbers, they tend to vote Federalist. So the two main parties at the time period is the Federalists and the Republicans. Jay was a Federalist. The Republicans are not so thrilled about this black voting power and might, and slowly but surely start passing disenfranchising measures. And eventually there's a new state constitution. There's a constitutional convention in New York in 1821. At this constitutional convention, this is right around the time that the Federalist Party is dying. I mean, we don't have a Federalist Party anymore, just in case anyone, they die. And there's a whole new party system that comes up out of that. And so right at the moment when the Federalists are sort of ceasing to be a party, New York holds a state constitutional convention. And it changes the structures of New York State in many, many ways. But one key thing for black men is it raises a property requirement for black men at the same time that basically abolishes property requirements for white men. So all of these black men who'd been voting on relatively equal terms now have to have $250 worth of property, and white men basically just have to have paid some taxes in the last year. So the way sort of the political maneuvering operates changes. Now, on one level, it is obviously a horrible thing to lose the right to vote. But what is, and this is sort of a sort of side argument of the book, is just how crucial petitioning is as a political tool in the 19th century. I don't think most of us sort of like think about petitioning as our number one political right. In the 19th century, women could petition, anyone's allowed to petition. And it's actually a way that citizens tell state legislatures what they want. And so petitions start pouring in across the state from a lot of actually anti-slavery white women and men from places like the Burnt Over District. And then there's these coordinated statewide campaigns of black men and women who just flood the legislature with various political objectives that they want. And sometimes actually they get it. I mean, that's I think was one of the surprises to me, is sort of, as you know, I think if you'd asked me 15 years ago if a bunch of people petitioned the state legislature, especially when like the men had been disfranchised and women couldn't vote at all, would the state legislature care? Turns out they did. And so they use this political tool of citizenship as a way of showing political might. Now, it really also, in any sort of party politics system, it really depended on who was in control of the state legislature or the Democrats. The governor or the state legislature. Whigs in this time period, this is where the Whigs come up. The Whigs tend to, if the Whigs are in control, you're probably going to see more anti-slavery legislation. If the Democrats are in control, it's harder to get anything done.
Do you have note cards and pens? Good, wonderful. Collect them and bring them up. And because we are coming to the end of our time, this is terrible. A J question.
Yeah.
How did the family members' views and tactics change over the three active generations, John Jay, William Jay, John Jay II?
So I will say this book by David Gelman is particularly good on this question. I mean, in some ways you can see going from John Jay to William Jay. There's also Peter Jay and Peter J. Monroe.
Yep.
I would say what unites all of these J men is they're really good lawyers. These are they understand state law, they understand the common law, they understand how courts work. They know, if you're sort of, you have a certain plaintiff in a certain case, that they're really smart about sort of like forum shopping, which judge do you go to, where am I going to get the best outcome? That's what I would say actually unites all of them, is they're really savvy, serious lawyers. But, John Jay, the founding father generation, he's not this is not like bare-knuckled politics, right? You're not even supposed to campaign at that time period. Jay, when he runs for governor, it's like his friends write nice letters. It's a less sort of in-your-faceness. William J., his son, is really important as sort of a judge and a legal thinker. He publishes some treaties and pamphlets, which are really important in terms of their legal sophistication about, for example, how the nation might end slavery. He's very learned, but he's also not sort of like, he's not really in the fray. John Jay, too, is in the fray. John Jay, too, is sort of like more like in courts. He's sort of, and I think Gelman's particularly good on this, but sort of he really wants to also integrate the Episcopalian Church. Mm-hmm. I think he's more of like a brash personality. If you read his letters too, John Jay too is really sort of like pushing people, and I mean that in a good way. But I think he's, but that's also just like, that's what's actually fun doing the long 19th century is like sort of political, like what's permissible and how people act changes, right? So in some ways, I think they had different personalities, but it's also sort of giving you the arc of like what the art of politics looked like changes dramatically from the late 1700s to the Civil War era.
Here's a big concept. What did gradual abolition actually accomplish? Did it accomplish freedom or citizenship or equality or different categories of rights or privileges? How do all of those categories blend or not blend?
I mean,
and you know, state citizenship versus national citizenship, state constitutions versus the federal constitution.
This is, I mean, in some ways, this is sort of like so much of what the book ends up being about. Gradual abolition in that law that I showed you, in some ways doesn't answer many of those questions. It doesn't say, are these children going to be citizens? It doesn't say, do they have the same rights and privileges as anyone else? So in some ways, and this is why I find this generation so inspiring, and I think the New York story is really important, and just to mention, like, there's 5 other northern states who do this, right? Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Connecticut, Rhode Island also passed gradual abolition. Massachusetts, there's like a Supreme Court case, a state Supreme Court case. Vermont abolished slavery in its constitution. It's an independent republic for a while. And New Hampshire sort of constitution is interpreted to end slavery. But the point is, like, there's actually, and then you have the whole Midwest and the Northwest ordinance. But the point is, there's actually many places across the United States that are sort of grappling with these questions. And New Yorkers end up getting answers in part because it's a political fight. These black New Yorkers, even though they aren't guaranteed citizenship in these laws, they fight their way into being recognized as state citizens. It's when they vote, right? So if you insist on voting, well, citizens usually vote, right? And then if you insist on voting and you've just elected a new state assemblyman into the state legislature with your votes, and that state assemblyman now has to decide, you know, in a speech whether or not black people are citizens, well, your constituencies just, you know, you just won the election because of those black swing voters, you're probably going to have incentive to say that you think they're citizens, right? It's this like piecemeal pushing and pushing and pushing, such that by the time of the Civil War, even sort of pro-slavery Democrats, there's a lot of pro-slavery racist white people in New York, but even some of them acknowledge, almost like, you know, they kind of have to grit their teeth, that black people are citizens of New York State. It's really not a question. It's written into laws and constitutions and a number of court cases. So in some ways, what does gradual abolition accomplish? What it does is I think it opens the door. It opens up the terrain of questions. And then it's the people on the ground and the leaders on the ground to actually answer the questions in the most affirmative ways possible. And so New York, by the eve of the Civil War, I would say New York and Massachusetts are sort of known as the 2 states where there's been sort of the most active progress for black citizens being recognized in various ways. And other states have some progress, but I think that's the answer is it was unknown, and then it became more known because of what the people in this book did.
We have an audience question, which is, how were the children of the rising generation protected before they gained their freedom? Were they protected against being sold? Were they protected against being sent out of state? What were the terms of their so-called indenture, and how was that a protection or not?
That is an excellent question. So on one level, if you're born technically a slave versus born a servant, you know, let's say you're born in 1798 versus 1799, your daily life is probably not going to look that different, right? You're living, you know, you have this white owner or master. that person can compel you to work, you're not getting paid wages. A servant and a slave, and this is an English common law, can both be beaten, right? This is, punishment or correction. You can also beat your children and your wives at this time period. Sort of the master of the household has a lot of power. And so on one level, like, it doesn't seem like the servant would be protected in ways different than an enslaved child. But servants, technically at law, are accorded certain privileges that an enslaved child would not be. So that's just out of sort of customary law. But then what happens is, because of these black voters and white anti-slavery abolitionists and lawmakers, it actually gets written into state law that there are certain things you just cannot do to a servant, even a black servant. And a good example is this question of, can you be sold out of state as a slave? And so just to give you a concrete example, Sojourner Truth, she's a slave in the Hudson River Valley. She's in Ulster County. Her son is, so she's enslaved and she gives birth to a son, and he's one of these freeborn servant children. And they're not living together, right? Because these servant children can still move from household to household. But they're not allowed to be taken out of state and sold, whereas an enslaved child could be. Peter is kidnapped and he is taken out of state. Sojourner Truth spends an entire winter in the freezing Hudson River Valley, going around to Quakers, to lawyers, to anyone who can help her. She ends up getting in touch with the New York Manumission Society, and eventually she actually gets Peter back. So her son, and the reason that Peter has to be brought home is because he is in this servant category. That is a protection that an enslaved mother with an enslaved child would not have had access to that sort of remedy. So on the one hand, that's a real protection that a servant child is given that a slave is not. And on the other hand, and I think it's important to say this, like, Peter was traumatized for life, right? So it sort of is the story with a quote unquote good ending, but you still have to imagine this child thinks he's been ripped from his mother for his entire life, and this sort of the psychological pain and trauma that they both experienced still happened, even though because of his different legal status, he was able to be brought home. So, and a lot of it too is like you had to be like sort of fortunate enough to have the mother or the helpful Quaker or the lawyer, because many children in that situation would have never come home, even though technically they weren't allowed to be taken out of state. So a lot of it just depended on the sort of the circumstance you were in. Yeah, totally.
I have one last question,
Okay.
which is, who was the best person you discovered in your researches, or who deserves the next biography?
Oh. So I do think I have a particular affection for James McCune Smith, the doctor that I told you about. He's become more famous, but I think he deserves, I think partly just, the nice thing about James McCune Smith too is because he did leave a lot of letters. He had daughters. Like, there's something about this, the way he talks about his children, I sort of fell in love with him as a father. I think he's definitely sort of the more famous of the book, but I think he's someone, I think it's crazy that we don't have like streets across New York State named after him. I think he should be on like dollar bills. Like, I have students who I teach at Penn. I teach quite a lot of pre-med students, and when they ask me to like write them a letter of recommendation for med school, I'm always like, I will write you the letter of recommendation for med school. We will get you into med school if you promise me that when you're a doctor, you will tell your patients about James McCune Smith. Like, I just think like there should be hospital wings named after James McCune Smith. So I'm going to nominate him for the moment.
All right.
Yeah.
Someone here can go start working on James McCune Smith.
Yeah.
We really have to stop. Thank you, Sarah, for helping us through this amazing story. Sarah's going to be signing books upstairs. Please follow our website. Please come to our next talks. And thank you so much for coming. And thank you, Sarah.
Thank you.